Karen's son stood in my driveway, pointing at my Harley like it already belonged to him. He actually said, "Mom says I can have it." 15 minutes later, cops were at my door, while I was literally preparing a briefing for the state attorney. Now, how in the world did we get there? That's the story I'm about to tell you. But first, let me back this up, because before the flashing lights, before the shouting, before Karen weaponized her HOA title, there was one very simple moment that lit the fuse, and it didn't start with the Harley. It started with a meeting, a demand, and a threat I brushed off too lightly. My name is Daniel Mercer, 49 years old, former Marine, current, security consultant, and, if you ask Karen, public enemy number one. Lakewood Heights was supposed to be quiet when I moved in. My house sat on the corner lot, tucked behind tall pines with enough garage, space to keep my 2 bikes, my tools, and a lifetime of memories. I wasn't looking for trouble. I wasn't looking for drama. But trouble has a way of finding you when people like Karen Brightwell get a taste of power. She'd only been in the neighborhood for 2 years when she clawed her way to HOA president, and from that moment forward, nothing in Lakewood Heights was ever the same. The first time she confronted me wasn't about the Harley, wasn't even about my property. It was about control. She called me out in front of the entire HOA board for keeping my garage lights on, past 10 p.m., claiming it violated the peace and harmony of the neighborhood. I laughed, thought it was a joke, and brushed it off. But Karen doesn't forget. She doesn't forgive. And when her teenage son laid eyes on my Harley a few weeks later, that's when she decided to take our Cold War and turn it into something far more dangerous. I'll tell you exactly what her son did next. But first, let me explain the move Karen made behind the scenes, the one that set the stage for cops showing up at my door. The meeting that changed everything happened on a Thursday night in the community clubhouse. One of those bland rooms with folding chairs, stale coffee, and the faint smell of cheap carpet cleaner. I wasn't even supposed to attend. I'd been working on estate security, briefing that week, and had more important things to worry about. But Karen had slipped a notice under my door, marked in bold letters, mandatory attendance, property compliance. I should have known right then she was setting a trap. I walked in wearing a leather jacket, ball cap pulled low, and immediately felt 30 pairs of eyes burn into me. Karen was at the head of the table, chin high, pearls gleaming under, the fluorescent lights like she was presiding over a courtroom. The first 10 minutes were about trivial nonsense, mailbox paint, lawn heights, the usual HOA control games, but then she turned to me. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice as sharp as broken glass. "We've received multiple complaints about the presence of your motorcycle." She said it like the word itself was toxic. I leaned back, arms folded, and let her talk. She rambled on about noise ordinances, property values, even claimed my Harley was intimidating to children walking to the bus stop. The board murmured in agreement, a few neighbors nodding like sheep. When she finally asked if I had anything to say, I looked her dead in the eye and said, "Karen, my bike isn't going anywhere. If you've got a problem with it, take it up with the law." The silence in that room was deafening. Karen's smile didn't break, but her eyes told the real story. She'd just declared war. And what I didn't know yet was that she wasn't planning to fight fair. In fact, while I thought this was just about a motorcycle, she was already setting in motion a plan that would bring cops to my front door. But before I tell you about that moment, I need to explain the stunt her son pulled first, because that was the spark that set off the firestorm. It was a Saturday morning when the first crack really showed. I had just rolled the Harley out of the garage, warming up the engine, letting that deep rumble settle into the air like thunder over the lake. To me, that sound was comfort, years of hard work, sweat, discipline, all wrapped in steel and chrome. To Karen's son, apparently, it was an invitation. He came strutting down the sidewalk like he owned it, ball cap backwards, phone in his hand recording me like I was some criminal. He didn't say hello, didn't ask permission, didn't even hesitate. He walked straight up to the bike, laid his hand on the handlebars and said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, "My mom says this is mine now." For a second, I thought he was joking. I actually laughed. But when he swung a leg over the seat, something in me snapped. I stepped forward, blocked him, and told him flat out, "Kid, touch that throttle and you won't like what happens next." His smirk vanished for a second, but then he pulled out his phone again, recording me, muttering, "Yeah, Mom's gonna love this." And that's when I realized this wasn't a teenage prank. This was staged. Karen had sent him, knowing full well I wouldn't stand for it, hoping to provoke me into something she could twist against me. I kept my cool, forced him off the bike, and told him to go home before things got ugly. He stormed back up the street, shouting, "I'm telling Mom." And you know what? He did. But he didn't just tell her. He gave her ammunition. Within the hour, Karen was already dialing numbers, telling neighbors I'd threatened her child, twisting the story into something unrecognizable. And that's exactly what set the next stage. Because by that evening, I wasn't just the guy with a Harley. I was suddenly the villain of the neighborhood. And Karen? She was about to play her next card, one that came with flashing red and blue lights. But before I get to that knock at my door, you need to know the lie she spread at the board meeting that week, because that's what tipped the scales completely. By the time the next HOA board meeting rolled around, Karen had already spread her version of the Harley incident through half the neighborhood. You could feel it in the air the moment I walked into that clubhouse. The looks, the whispers, the quiet side eyes like I was some kind of criminal. I sat down, arms folded, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. Karen cleared her throat, stood tall at the podium, and in her best concerned leader voice, announced, "We've had a disturbing event involving one of our homeowners and a minor child. For the safety of our community, this matter must be addressed immediately." She didn't name me at first. She didn't have to. Every set of eyes in that room turned toward me. Karen launched into this dramatic speech about how her teenage son had been physically intimidated and verbally threatened simply for walking past my property. She painted him as some innocent boy who happened to wander too close to my garage. She even threw in a line about how the sound of my Harley was traumatizing for neighborhood children. I sat there, jaw tight, every muscle in my body wanting to explode. But I didn't. I knew exactly what she was doing, baiting me, trying to get me to snap in front of witnesses. Instead, I raised my hand, waited for her to finish her theater act, and simply said, "Karen, if you want to accuse me of something, put it in writing. Otherwise, stop wasting everyone's time." The room went silent. A few neighbors looked shocked that I dared to push back. Karen's smile flickered, but she didn't stop. She doubled down, saying the matter was already being escalated to the authorities. That's when it hit me. She wasn't just bluffing. She'd already made the call. And while I sat there surrounded by neighbors swallowing her lies, I had no idea that within days I'd be facing the consequence of her performance, the sound of knuckles on my door, followed by the cold red and blue glow of patrol cars outside my window. But before I tell you about that knock, let me explain why Karen's timing was so deliberate, because it wasn't just about the HOA. She knew exactly what I was working on with the state attorney, and she used it against me. At that point, you might wonder, why would a neighborhood busybody like Karen risk escalating things to law enforcement over a motorcycle? The answer is timing. See, what Karen didn't know when she first picked this fight, but quickly discovered through the neighborhood grapevine, was that I wasn't just some retiree with a loud Harley. I was contracted as a security consultant, preparing a confidential briefing for the state attorney's office. It was about organized theft rings operating in the county, the kind of case that drew a lot of eyes, a lot of headlines, and a lot of pressure from the higher-ups. My name was circulating in rooms Karen had no business knowing about. But somehow she found out. And when a woman like Karen realizes the man she already hates is connected to the attorney's office, she doesn't back down. She doubles down. She started telling anyone who would listen that I was hiding behind government connections, that I thought I was untouchable. To her, that made me an even bigger target. So she timed it perfectly. Right as I was finalizing that briefing, while my calendar was tied to courthouse meetings, she escalated her little vendetta into something much bigger. Because if there's one thing Karen craves more than control, it's attention. And what better way to get it than by claiming she was protecting the neighborhood from the dangerous man on the corner lot? I didn't see it then, but she was laying the foundation for the ambush that was coming. And the night it finally happened, I was sitting at my desk with briefing papers spread across the table when I heard it. 3 hard knocks on the door, the kind that freeze your blood. The cops had arrived, but before I tell you what they said, you need to know the little trick Karen pulled to make sure they believed every word of her story. Here's the thing about Karen. She never comes at you head on. She sets traps. And the trap she set for me was nothing short of genius in its pettiness. See, by the time the police knocked on my door, she had already armed herself with what looked like evidence. And not just any evidence, carefully twisted, hand-picked fragments of reality. For starters, she had screenshots. Somehow, her son's shaky video of me blocking him from climbing onto my Harley was already circulating in a neighborhood Facebook group, edited down to make it look like I was looming over him, fists clenched, while he looked small and scared. No context, no sound. Just 30 seconds of what she wanted people to see. On top of that, she had printed emails. She claimed she'd warned me multiple times about my bike, producing a stack of so-called HOA correspondence that, to this day, I swear I never received. But the worst part? She brought in witnesses. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to suddenly swore they'd seen me yelling at the boy, parroting her narrative, as if they'd rehearsed it. Karen had built a paper fortress around her lie, so by the time the cops showed up, they weren't knocking to ask questions. They were knocking because they thought they already had the answers. And that's why, when I opened that door and saw 2 deputies standing there with stern faces and notepads in hand, I knew this wasn't going to be a friendly chat. But before I tell you what happened on my front porch that night, let me explain the one fatal flaw in Karen's plan, the detail she didn't account for, the piece of truth that would eventually unravel her entire story. The beauty of a lie is also its weakness. It always leaves gaps. And Karen, for all her scheming, left one gaping hole wide open. She built her whole case on the idea that I had threatened her son, that I was aggressive, dangerous, unstable, but what she didn't count on was that my property has something most people forget about: cameras. Not security cameras I bragged about or showed off, but small, silent, motion-activated. Cameras tucked neatly under the eaves of my garage and facing the driveway. I'd installed them years back after a string of petty thefts in the neighborhood, and honestly I'd stopped thinking about them. But they were there, always recording. And what did they capture that day? Her son, bold as brass, marching onto my property, climbing onto my Harley without permission, smirking into his phone, and me, calm, arms down, blocking him with nothing more than words. No yelling, no fists, just a man protecting what was his. Karen didn't know I had that footage. She didn't even suspect. To her, she'd built a perfect illusion, airtight and convincing. And maybe for the neighbors it was enough. Maybe for the HOA board it was enough. But for law enforcement, evidence is king. Still, I didn't reveal that card the moment the deputies knocked. No, I kept it close because timing was everything. Karen had fired her first shot, and now I had the ammunition to fire back. And when the truth finally came out, it wouldn't just clear my name, it would turn the entire community against her. But before I explain how I played that card, let me take you back to that night at my front door, when 2 deputies stood waiting, and I had to make a split-second choice about how to handle Karen's accusations. The knock came again, harder this time. 3 raps that echoed through the house like gunshots. I set down the briefing papers, took a slow breath, and opened the door. 2 deputies stood on my porch, uniforms sharp, hands resting just a little too close to their belts. One of them, a tall guy with a mustache, spoke first. "Mr. Mercer, we need to talk about an incident involving you and a minor." My stomach tightened. I already knew whose minor we were talking about. Behind them, I could see Karen across the street, standing on her lawn with her, arms crossed, her son lurking just behind her with that smug, satisfied grin. This was her stage, and the cops were her actors. I stayed calm, asked the deputies what exactly I was being accused of. They told me I'd allegedly threatened physical harm against Karen's son, that multiple witnesses had confirmed it, and that the HOA president had provided supporting documentation. In other words, they were walking up my porch with a story already written. They just needed me to play my role. For a second, I considered blowing up right there, shouting down the absurdity of it all. But then I remembered something. Karen didn't know about the footage. She didn't know I had proof. So instead of fighting, I kept my voice level. I invited the deputies inside, offered them a seat at the table, and said, "Gentlemen, before you go any further, you should probably see something." I booted up the monitor, pulled up the timestamp, and cued the video. Their faces were unreadable at first. Eyes locked on the screen as Karen's son marched up, climbed onto my Harley, and recorded himself smirking. Then their eyes flicked to me, calmly stepping forward, arms down, blocking him. No yelling, no fists, just restraint. When the clip ended, I leaned back and said, "So, does that look like a threat to you?" The silence that followed was worth every second of patience. But the real moment came after, when one deputy leaned forward and asked me a question Karen never expected, a question that flipped her entire story upside down. The deputy with the mustache leaned forward, elbows on the table, and asked in a low, steady voice, "Mr. Mercer, would you be willing to provide us a copy of this footage for our report?" That was the moment the ground shifted. Up until then, Karen had been holding all the cards, the fake emails, the edited video, the witnesses parroting her script. But now, the deputies weren't just listening. They were asking me for evidence. Evidence she didn't even know existed. I nodded, saved the clip to a drive, and handed it over. The deputy slipped it into his pocket and gave me a look that said more than his words ever could. He wasn't buying Karen's performance anymore. And right there, on my own front porch, I watched her perfect little story begin to crack. Because while the deputies had kept their faces neutral, I saw one of them glance across the street, his eyes narrow as he looked at Karen standing with her arms folded like a queen awaiting tribute. He knew. He might not have said it out loud yet, but he knew this wasn't the open and shut case she'd promised. Still, they kept it professional. They told me they'd file their report, that they might have follow-up questions, and then they left. Karen tried to intercept them, chattering nervously, waving papers, but the deputies brushed her off and drove away. And from my window, I saw her face change. That smug confidence drained into something tighter, sharper, fear. She realized her plan hadn't gone the way she wanted, but she wasn't done. Not by a long shot, because when someone like Karen feels power slipping, they don't surrender, they escalate. And her next move was the one that would drag the entire neighborhood into the fight. The fallout didn't take long. Within days of that porch visit, the neighborhood felt like it had split into two camps. On one side were Karen's loyalists, the neighbors who either feared her or secretly loved the drama she stirred up. On the other side were the quiet ones, the folks who'd watched from a distance, and were starting to realize maybe, just maybe, they'd been fed a pack of lies. And right in the middle, me, the man Karen had painted as the villain. She wasn't about to let the deputies' visit end things. No, she doubled down. Flyers started appearing on mailboxes, anonymous at first, but we all knew whose hands had folded them. They accused me of being unstable, of endangering children even. Hinted that my Harley was somehow connected to criminal activity. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so vicious. Then came the meetings. Karen called for an emergency HOA session, and this time, it wasn't about mailboxes or lawns. It was about me. Neighbors who'd once waved politely at me were suddenly standing at microphones demanding my removal from the community. And through it all, Karen sat at the head table pretending to mediate when really she was fanning the flames. But here's the thing about fire. Once it spreads, you can't control where it burns. A few brave neighbors started pushing back, asking for proof. Others mentioned the footage I'd shown the deputies. Whispers turned into open arguments. The boardroom that night sounded less like a neighborhood meeting and more like a courtroom brawl. And that's when Karen made her biggest mistake yet. She turned her anger into a legal threat, one that, ironically, would force me to bring out the very connections she had been mocking all along. But before I tell you how that lawsuit threat backfired, you need to hear about the private call I got from one of the deputies, the same man who'd taken my footage. It was late, maybe close to midnight, when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. Normally I wouldn't have answered, but something told me this wasn't a telemarketer. On the other end was a familiar voice, the tall deputy with the mustache who'd stood on my porch just days earlier. His tone was low, careful, the kind of voice you use when you don't want your words traced back. He said, "Mr. Mercer, off the record, you might want to keep that footage handy. Karen's making a lot of noise downtown." My grip tightened on the phone. He went on to explain that she hadn't just filed a complaint with the HOA. She'd marched herself straight to the sheriff's office, demanding charges. She was spinning the story bigger than before, now claiming I'd threatened her entire family, not just her son. But here's where things got interesting. The deputy admitted the brass weren't exactly buying it. "We've seen folks like her before," he said. "People who think the HOA badge gives them more power than it does." Still, he warned me, noise doesn't just vanish. If she kept hammering the right ears, eventually someone higher up might decide to act just to quiet her down. Then his voice dropped even lower. "Between you and me, the footage you've got, it might end up being the thing that saves you." And just like that, the line went dead. I sat there staring at the phone, realizing something chilling. This wasn't just a neighborhood squabble anymore. Karen was trying to drag me into an actual legal storm. And the only way out wasn't just defense, it was offense. But before I show you how I turned her own tactics against her, let me tell you about the lawsuit threat she dropped at the very next meeting, and why it was the beginning of her downfall. The next HOA meeting didn't feel like a meeting at all. It felt like a trial. The clubhouse was packed shoulder to shoulder, neighbors whispering in, tight clusters, waiting for the drama they knew Karen would deliver. And she didn't disappoint. She walked in late, papers clutched to her chest, that fake smile plastered on her face like she'd already won. After a few minutes of hollow chatter about landscaping, she dropped the bomb. "As of today, I have begun consulting with legal counsel regarding a civil action against Mr. Mercer." You could feel the air shift. Half the room gasped. The other half leaned forward like they'd just bought front row tickets. Karen milked the moment, waving the papers like they were holy scripture. She claimed I had harassed her son, created a hostile environment for the entire community, and caused emotional distress that was damaging property values. I sat there stone-faced, letting her rant, because I already knew something. She didn't. Bluffs only work when you can pay the buy-in. And Karen? Karen had no idea what kind of fire she'd just lit. Because the second she said the word lawsuit, she crossed into a world where facts actually mattered. Judges don't run on gossip. Courts don't accept HOA meeting minutes as gospel. And me? I wasn't just some guy on a Harley. I was a man with legal contacts, a folder of evidence, and a very patient state attorney who already knew my name. Karen thought she was pulling me into her battlefield. What she didn't realize was that she'd just wandered into mine. And the next move I made, the letter I sent her attorney, was the one that turned her entire crusade into a ticking time bomb. But before I reveal what was in that letter, let me show you how the neighborhood itself started to unravel once word of her lawsuit threat spread. The lawsuit threat didn't just rattle me, it rattled the entire community. For years, Karen had ruled Lakeview Estates with fear and manipulation, barking orders about lawn heights, mailbox colors, and even the approved hours for barbecuing. Most people went along just to keep the peace, but when she dropped the word lawsuit, something cracked. Neighbors who had once bowed their heads started whispering louder, comparing stories, realizing they weren't the only ones she had bullied. The woman on the corner, Mrs. Lopez, quietly admitted Karen had fined her $200 for a garden trellis that was 2 inches too tall. The Andersons, who lived 3 doors down, confessed Karen once tried to have their dog banned from the lake path because it looked aggressive. One by one, people began piecing together the same pattern. Karen wasn't protecting the community, she was controlling it. And now she was threatening to drag everyone's money, everyone's dues into a personal vendetta against me. That was the turning point. Because suddenly this wasn't just my fight, it was the neighborhood's. I could see it in the shifting eyes during the meeting, hear it in the murmurs after she stormed out waving her papers. People were starting to question her. People were starting to resist. And that's when I decided to play my card, because Karen had handed me a gift, a lawsuit threat that forced everything into the light of day. And the letter I sent in response, the one her attorney opened a week later, didn't just answer her accusations. It detonated them. But before I show you the words that silenced her smile, let me explain how I made sure that letter would echo across the entire neighborhood, leaving no place for her to hide. I didn't waste a single day after that meeting. If Karen wanted to play lawyer, I was more than happy to step onto that field. I sat down at my desk, gathered the footage, the deputy's statements, and even a few signed accounts from neighbors who had grown tired of her antics. Then I drafted a letter, not to Karen but to her attorney. Every word was deliberate, every sentence a nail in the coffin of her claims. I laid out the timeline, her son trespassing, the video evidence showing 0 threats, the false witness statements she had manufactured. I cited the statutes on harassment, defamation, and misuse of HOA funds for personal crusades. And then I closed it with the one line that changed everything. Should your client proceed with this frivolous lawsuit, be advised that a countersuit will be filed immediately, one which will seek damages in excess of 6 figures and will include personal liability. In plain English, if Karen moved forward, she wouldn't just lose. She'd risk losing her savings, her standing, maybe even her house. I mailed it certified, ensuring her lawyer had to sign for it. And here's the thing, lawyers hate clients like Karen, clients who lie, who exaggerate, who drag them into hopeless cases. So when that letter hit his desk, the effect was immediate. A week later, Karen wasn't strutting around with legal papers anymore. She was quieter, sharper, her smile tighter. She'd felt the teeth of the trap she tried to spring on me. But the story doesn't end there, because even cornered animals lash out, and Karen wasn't done scheming. Which brings me to the final act, the desperate move she tried to make, and the way it finally, permanently blew up in her face. Cornered people are dangerous, and Karen was no exception. After her lawyer backed off, she knew the lawsuit wouldn't stick. But instead of retreating, she went for one last desperate play. She tried to rally the HOA board into voting for a special assessment, a sneaky little maneuver that would have forced every homeowner, including me, to pay higher dues to cover her legal expenses. It was bold, it was shameless, and it was her final mistake. Because by then the tide had turned. The neighbors she once intimidated weren't silent anymore. They showed up at the emergency meeting in force, angry, loud, and armed with their own stories. One after another, they stood and recounted how she had bullied them, fined them, humiliated them. What started as a meeting became a trial, but this time, Karen was the one in the defendant's chair. When it came to the vote, the result wasn't even close. Not only was her special assessment denied, but a motion was introduced to remove her as HOA president, effective immediately. The cheers that erupted that night, I'll never forget them. Karen stormed out, face red, papers clutched to her chest, her son trailing behind with none of his old swagger. For the first time, she wasn't the queen of Lakeview Estates. She was just another neighbor who'd pushed too far and lost everything. And me? I kept my Harley, my home, and most importantly, my peace. Sometimes battles aren't won with fists or shouting. Sometimes they're won with patience, evidence, and timing. And in the end, Karen's downfall wasn't because of me. It was because she couldn't stop digging a hole she thought she could bury me in. Instead, she buried herself. If you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare, you know the kind of power games people like Karen try to play. But here's the truth. Bullies collapse when their lies meet facts. Now I want to hear your story. Drop a comment below and tell me the worst HOA drama you've ever seen. And if you want more real stories of neighborhood wars, betrayals, and justice. Served, hit subscribe and check out the next video linked on screen. Trust me, if you thought Karen was bad, you haven't seen anything yet.